Hello and welcome. My name is Cary Cheshire with Texans for Fiscal Responsibility, joined here by Tim Harden, talking today about the Fiscal Responsibility Index, which we're happy and excited to release following the conclusion of the Texas legislature down in Austin. Tim, we saw legislators come down to Austin for 140 days, which they do every 2 years. They passed a lot of bills. They passed the budget, the one bill that they have to do to get out of town. But taxpayers were left a little bit wanting, I think, based off the outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, we have the declaration that it was the most conservative session ever. I don't know if I would necessarily agree with that. We did get some important things done. However, on fiscal matters, I think we were lacking a little bit, and I think that'll show today.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we're really proud to release the Fiscal Responsibility Index, which is our tool for measuring how lawmakers are committed to fiscal responsibility, limited government, kind of the cornerstones of our Republican form of government here in Texas. As you can imagine, there are some lawmakers who did pretty good and have good scores, have a positive voting record. Some lawmakers did not do as well. As you can imagine, the folks who did well do like our ratings and are kind of excited to put it on their metaphorical refrigerator and send it out in mail that you're going to start receiving pretty soon. Other people will come out and say that, we're just one of the scorecards. We don't do anything. To be fair, we kind of are one of the scorecards. I think Tim and I would tell you that we are the best scorecard of measuring lawmakers' commitment to fiscal conservative public policy, personal responsibility, and good governance. However, there are some issues that we don't include on the Fiscal Responsibility Index, Tim.
Yeah, we're not really covering social issues. We have pro-life groups they're going to cover that. We have Right to Life. You have the abolitionists and other people who create those scorecards. We try to keep focused on tax dollars and fiscal issues. Sometimes it has a little bit of overlap, but what we're focused on is, are we spending taxpayer dollars responsibly?
Yeah, a great example of that overlap is when we talk about like kind of local funding for Planned Parenthood. I know in the People's Republic of Austin, they've worked to facilitate abortion with local tax dollars. Tim, we also saw a constitutional carry, a bill that has a fiscal implication, has a personal liberties implication, but also a gun rights bill come up, and we did choose to include that on the index.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think when it comes to core rights, I think it's important, but also you have things like LTC fees and funding that goes into running these programs that absolutely have tax implications.
That's right. Well, let's go ahead and get into the index and start talking about what you are tuning in here to see. We're going to start off with some top-line data about the Texas House, which is kind of where we've seen the majority of the action happen. As folks who are familiar with watching the Texas legislature know that there's a lot of kind of orchestrated efforts that happen in the Texas Senate, but the House is a lot more kind of unruly and typically where you see a lot more disparities in that chamber. So kind of starting from the top, we have 151 total votes that we chose to rate on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. Tim, there's about, 1,200, 1,400, 1,600 votes total that lawmakers take every session?
Roughly, yeah. We usually have, about a little 4,000 to 5,000 actual bills filed, and about a quarter of that is what we actually vote on.
Yeah, so obviously it's very difficult for folks at home to go through each and every one of those bills. Don't worry, Tim and I did, and we chose chose which ones to include. And if you go to index.texastaxpayers.com, you can see each vote, whether it's a bill, an amendment, a concurrent resolution, anything like that, and why we chose to include it. But out of those 151 total votes, we saw lawmakers get a rating based off of how they did on those votes. The best one got a 98, a Republican that we'll reveal here in just a moment. The worst Republican got a 28. So you got a 70-point disparity between the best Republican and the worst Republican on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. But I think kind of the more interesting thing is when you move to the Democrat caucus, the best performing Democrat earned a 27. The worst performing Democrats, there were a number of them, earned an 11. Tim, I think this kind of goes to what we've seen throughout the Texas House, where oftentimes you see a coalition government of Republicans and Democrats running the chamber. And you really see oftentimes the more liberal Republicans holding sway in the Texas House and conservative Republicans kind of more far out of touch.
Yeah, I think this session was no different. It's you have a regime change that happened. However, it's the same good old boy club that's always been in charge. We saw a number of conservative priorities go down because of that this year. And I would say, in some of the legislators that we're used to looking at, we've seen these scores come down a little bit. We've seen, it looks like we saw the Overton window shift a little bit left this go around, at least on fiscal matters.
Yeah, absolutely. Oftentimes on the fiscal responsibility index, you see a lot of lawmakers that start out very well and kind of atrophy over time, beginning the long march from an A to an F. And oftentimes, when we talk about the Texas GOP priorities, grassroots conservative priorities, things that taxpayers wanted to see done, that didn't get done, things like actually passing property tax relief, election integrity, other matters like that. I know our friends at Texas Scorecard have done a great job covering those issues. But when lawmakers are failing to get those achievements across the finish line, they're failing to get those on the floor, they're failing to get record votes on that, and they're not giving it to you and I so that we can go rate it and say that lawmakers did well, right?
Yeah, and that's some of what historically the speaker has always done, is shield those who put him in power from taking these hard votes. And in the past, we've had a number of legislators that were on point calling record votes. We saw a little bit less of that this go around, but we still had some champions that were able to put them on the record. But there is absolutely an effort to shield these legislators from taking hard votes and being ultimately held accountable by taxpayers.
Yeah, well, kind of speaking about lawmakers, putting other lawmakers on the record, we'll go ahead and get to our top performer in the Texas House. This ought to come to no surprise to a lot of people who are following the Texas legislature, and it is Bryan Slayton, a freshman Republican from East Texas. Tim, Bryan came in and kind of on the first day of the session set a name for himself by saying, "I'm voting against Dade Phelan." Throughout the rest of the session, he was fighting against gender modification, fighting to pass conservative policies. He carried amendments preventing Democrats from being committee chairs. And it's really kind of no surprise that he earned the best rating on the Fiscal Responsibility Index.
Yeah, and what impressed me about him is not only is he voting correctly, but sometimes it takes more than just pushing that button. And so from a personal level, watching what he did, it reminded me quite a bit of my old boss, Jonathan Stickland, and him voicing his concerns and standing up not only for social issues, but the time wasting and everything that went down, that ultimately ended up killing many fiscal bills at the end of the day. And so he had a very impressive session.
Yeah, you talk about all the stuff that we don't encapsulate on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. I think back to, for example, his rules amendment that says, hey, we're not going to rename any roads until after we've abolished abortion in the state of Texas. That's not something that's a fiscal issue, not something that we chose to put on the Fiscal Responsibility Index, but something that I think a lot of taxpayers back home looked at and said, this is kind of an opportunity for my lawmaker to show what his priority is, right? Is it really, naming a stretch of road after a 40-year county commissioner, or is it doing the things that you actually put on your push card and defending the unborn?
Yeah, I wish we would have had the foresight to see the other tomfoolery that was going to go on. We had a number of very important bills die, including an important election integrity bill. But we did pass mustache resolutions. We did name Dr. Pepper as the official drink of Texas and the mermaid capital. And so there was a number of other bills that got attention and that ultimately wasted time. And that's not even counting the House taking off 2 days with the infighting. Yeah. And so... So I was glad to see him at least mention that in the rules. I'd like to see them maybe deal with that next session.
Absolutely. Well, it wasn't just Bryan Slayton that earned an A on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. This is not the Bryan Slayton Show. Kind of moving on, we're going to go through the rest of the taxpayer champions, the lawmakers that earned a 90 or above on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. And next up is the guy who replaced your old boss, Jonathan Stickland, up there in House District 92, State Representative Jeff Cason. Yeah,
I was really glad to see his performance this go around. Our worry and being a part of the staff that represented House District 92, there is this worry that, are we going to continue to be represented by a conservative, fiscally responsible representative? And that absolutely was the case. He did a fantastic job this session.
Yeah, Jeff Cason coming in with a 96 on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. That's 2 points behind our top performer of State Representative Bryan Slayton. As a reminder, if you're interested in why these lawmakers got a 98 versus a 96 versus the scores that we're going to go on through the rest of the program, please visit index.texastaxpayers.com. Right there you can see every single vote that we chose to include, how your lawmaker voted on it, how other lawmakers voted on it, and there you can kind of get an idea. I know when you look at, for example, State Representative Bryan Slayton's, the reason why he earned a 98 on our index is you look at bills such as a one to give kind of loan forgiveness and scholarships to rural veterinarians. As someone who represents East Texas, he decided that was important for his district. That's fine. If you decide that's actually important, just go ahead and adjust his score a little bit in your head. But from our perspective, from the perspective of kind of taxpayers and our legislative priorities, we thought that wasn't the best vote. But of course, you can have your own perspective. We think that's great. If you're better informed after looking at our index and you kind of think, hey, I actually think this lawmaker did better, I think that's a great way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Would you you want to talk about a few of the things that Jeff Cason did this go around that kind of made him stand out, some amendments and things he took a stand for?
Well, the thing that I remember most is another one of these issues that we did not include on the Fiscal Responsibility Index, but was an amendment onto House Bill 5, a big rural broadband expansion bill, basically asking the state to prioritize companies that install a filter that blocks pornography. We've seen in other countries that pornography is blocked by default, and individuals who want to go ahead and pursue viewing such material can contact their internet service provider and have that switch flipped. As you can imagine, there's probably a lot of parents at home and wives who would not make that phone call. But sadly, that amendment was not kept on. In fact, we saw the Senate, through State Senator Robert Nichols, very doggedly determined to remove that amendment at the behest of big tech, who did not want it as a barrier to providing internet services out to rural communities in the state of Texas. But you have that. You have a lot of fights on critical race theory by Jeff Cason. And then I think about a budget amendment that he offered that would have defunded the State Board of Geoscientists, which is something that the Sunset Commission, a group of government bureaucrats, had recommended abolishing and prioritizing that funding to bulletproof vests for police. Of course, that amendment was killed in the Texas House on a record vote, which is included on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. But those are just a few of the items that Jeff Cason did.
Yeah. Who do we have next on the list?
Yeah, so coming up, speaking about critical race theory, right next we have Steve Toth. And Steve Toth is actually joined at a 94 by State Representative Kyle Biederman and State Representative Briscoe Cain. Folks probably remember Representative Toth for the one who carried the critical race theory ban in the Texas House. Of course, they also remember that he accepted a ton of Democrat amendments onto that they said were going to get stripped in the Senate and then ultimately kind of weren't. But of course, that's Steve Toth. Kyle Biederman, a lawmaker who we saw fighting very doggedly on local and consent, backing up longtime Republican Tom Craddock and killing some Democrat bills. That was encouraging to see. And Briscoe Cain, the top member of Phelan's leadership team here on the Fiscal Responsibility Index, the chair of the Elections Committee. Of course, that bill ultimately, though, did not pass as a result, perhaps, of delay by Briscoe Cain, perhaps bungling it in committee, perhaps the Democrats running away with everything. Perhaps it was Phelan cutting a deal with the Democrats to allow them to walk out. A kind of frustrating outcome that puts, I think, a black mark on his time as the chair of the Elections Committee. But it is interesting, though. This is the first time in recent memory, Tim, that I can think of that we've had someone who is a part of the leadership team, is a committee chair that's earning an A on the Fiscal Responsibility Index.
Yeah, I think overall, Briscoe did a wonderful job this session. I will say, he had a slight slide, right? But I think the previous two scorecards, it was him and my old boss like vying for the top slot, and I think in past he scored maybe 98s or 99s, and he slipped a little bit, but overall a 94 is a great score, and I think he had a great session overall. And that it is weird to see a speaker's team member that high up in the scorecard. So let's hope he can keep that up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, next up, of course, we have State Representative Tony Tinderholt from Arlington, a lawmaker who's kind of been a big active guy in fighting to prevent the expansion of veterans benefits to non-veterans. carried a lot of pro-energy amendments on the Texas budget that was very encouraging. State Representative Matt Schaefer quickly behind him, who had a fantastic session, I think, with the passage of constitutional carry and the House passage of civil asset forfeiture reform. Ultimately, that bill was killed in the Texas Senate, but an encouraging outcome nonetheless from Matt Schaefer. Rounding out the taxpayer champions, we've got Mays Middleton, who unfortunately kind of his best bills of the session were killed by leadership, most prominently the ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying. And then Cody Vasut, which is an interesting thing because here we have the successor to State Representative Dennis Bonnen, the former Speaker of the Texas House, who had to announce he was not running for re-election in disgrace. A big change there to take literally the Speaker of the Texas House, who was often killing conservative priorities, and replace him with somebody who's getting an A on the Fiscal Responsibility Index.
Yeah, a big surprise, a pleasant surprise. Anytime you have someone like Bonnen, who usually wasn't in the top tier, and he's replaced with someone who scores an A on the index, it's a wonderful thing for taxpayers, and I was happy to see it.
Yeah, well, kind of moving on from the people who earned A's on the Fiscal Responsibility Index and kind of going into kind of how do we really evaluate the Dade Phelan leadership regime, right? We talked about Briscoe Cain, who did have an A on the Fiscal Responsibility Index, being a committee chair. But when we get into really the top committee chairs for Dade Phelan, we unfortunately see a much different result. So for example, we're going to talk about the Calendar's chairman, Dustin Burrows, who came in with a 40 on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. This is a big drop from Burrows, who at one point had an A on the Fiscal Responsibility Index back in 2015 when he voted for Scott Turner for Speaker, now coming in with a 40. And of course, this is just one of the many items people are frustrated with Burrows at this session. Of course, he bungled, probably deliberately, House Bill 3 and made it, instead of a bill restricting the governor's power, to one kind of ratifying it. A number of tax increases, and then most prominently a bill that is not on our radar because it's not a fiscal issue, but it is a conservative issue. It's the gender modification bills, which were killed in the Calendars Committee, a very frustrating session for grassroots conservatives looking at Dustin Burrows' record.
Yeah, I think you look at specifically what happened with the gender modification bill and just having your ear to the ground and listening to the grassroots, there were some people who were rightly so extremely upset about that because the bill came over, I believe, in late April into the House chamber, and they absolutely slow-walked it, and there was a lot of banter on social media about it. But to me, when you look at the calendar's rules and how much time they had to get that thing passed, they had enough time. And so,
he's literally being called out by Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a very rare thing to see in Texas politics, but I think kind of speaks to kind of the overarching theme for Dustin Burrows this session. But kind of next up is Chris Patty, who is the chairman of the State Affairs Committee, arguably the most powerful committee in the Texas House, which was used to do what? To kill the ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying and kill the legislation to build the border wall.
Yeah, it's a shame, but honestly, with Patty and looking at his performance from the past, this is kind of par for the course. I didn't really expect him to come through with an A this session. He's kind of always been one of those speaker team members, one of those members who is typically pulling the House to the left.
Right. Another one, kind of rounding out the leadership team. Therefore, Dade Phelan, we had Greg Bonnen, who carried the budget in the Texas House. Bonnen does a little bit better than kind of the traditional leaders in terms of Burrows and Patty, in that he earned a 54 on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. Of course, he's the one who shepherds the budget that does not prioritize property tax relief. Instead says we need to spend millions more on corporate welfare and growing government in Texas. But I do believe that Bonnen does get credit for passing a spending limits bill that does apply to more of the budget and will be good for taxpayers over time. The question is just, okay, are we limiting spending so we can dedicate money in property tax relief, or are we limiting spending for, prioritizing other things instead?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the conversations that happened around the budget this go round, property tax was almost non-existent. When you look at last go round and the calls and screams for property tax reform, and really what we got, which was not any kind of a relief, but rather a cap on growth. I absolutely thought going into this session that we would see an addition to that, and that we would see property tax pulled back and some relief actually happen. But I was surprised that there was just crickets this session on property tax.
Another lawmaker I kind of want to talk about here is State Representative Jeff Leach, somebody who came in as a conservative lawmaker, used to have an A on the Fiscal Responsibility Index, much like Dustin Burrows. Over time, he has gotten significantly worse in terms of a voting record, and most frustratingly here, in terms of his voting record this session, not only does Jeff Leach get an F on the Fiscal Responsibility Index, but he is also perhaps the individual with the most journal statements after the fact of changing his vote. As a reminder, on the Fiscal Responsibility Index, we do honor journal statements. By and large, these are, I think, good faith messages put in by lawmakers who said, hey, I was sick while this vote was happening, I was away from my desk, or literally I hit the wrong button, made a mistake. And the long practice of Texans for Fiscal Responsibility is to honor those statements. However, as we're pulling those records when they're happening shortly after the fact, and then when we go back to double check and prepare for this show and the publication of the index, there is a wide disparity for some lawmakers who seem to have perhaps taken the ratings that we announce in advance of bills on the Fiscal Responsibility Index and instead decide to come in and switch on the record on those votes in an effort to perhaps inflate their score. Here we see that effort failed, still earned a 69, but I think it is worth talking about, Tim. I mean, from your perspective as a staffer, obviously there's been instances where your former boss, State Representative Jonathan Stickland, issued a journal statement.
Yeah, I mean, it is a common practice, but typically it's done when the member is away from their desk and there's a mistake made, or they're absent and they wanted to go on the record. But we've known for a long time that these are used to game scorecards, not only the TFR scorecard, but I've seen it done for the Rice scorecard as well. And it's a shame, because really when I see how many times I saw Leach go back and change his score, what I think he's trying to do is straddle. You've seen him, I think with, in his mind, the polling and where his district is headed, he's made that decision that too many Republicans make, which is, well, maybe I can get reelected by leaning a little further left and playing the game a little more. But at the same time, he wants the grassroots cred and he wants to appear as a conservative. So he kind of tries to do both. And we'll see if he can keep the act up and people will believe him.
Yeah, we will indeed see. But kind of to finally conclude what we're talking about here in the Texas House, Tim, I think it's worthwhile to compare the two caucus chairs. So for the Republicans, you have State Representative Jim Murphy. Jim Murphy comes in with a rating of a 35 on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. That is among the lowest in the pack. Of course, we mentioned that the lowest Republican score is a 28 on the index. Meanwhile, the Democrat caucus chair, Chris Turner, comes in tied for the lowest Democrat score with an 11. Tim, I think this kind of speaks to the difference in styles between Republicans and Democrats, in that Republicans put forward a candidate who wants to compromise with Democrats, and Democrats put forward a caucus leader who literally is the leader of the liberal wing.
Yeah, I mean, when we were going back through and checking, though, I noticed that Turner was at the bottom, and in my head, I'm like, yeah, it kind of makes sense. The big government spending, you would kind of expect somebody who has that ideology to be lower. But what you wouldn't expect in the Texas House with a majority of Republicans is that the Republican chair is just almost at the rock bottom of the Republicans. You would think that in order, once again, to mention that Overton window, to pull the House right, that we would choose somebody who is way further up, who is going to pull the House to a more fiscally responsible stance. But we have two lefties that are kind of...
Well, it's yeah, I mean, if you think about this from a congressional perspective, right? I mean, it's like you've got Chris Turner is basically Nancy Pelosi, right? And then who did the Republicans put up? Well, it's like a John McCain kind of figure. It's a John Cornyn kind of figure who is immediately going to compromise. A very interesting result there. But then, of course, we'll get to the actual bottom Republican and talk about him for a second. State Representative Kyle Cassell from kind of more central Texas, representing Bryan and some other areas kind of there in the College Station, Waco area. Kyle Cassell earning a 28 on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. That's just 1 point higher than State Representative Richard Raymond, who earned a 27. We'll also give a shout out to Ryan Guillen, who also earned a 27. Guillen, someone who's known for being pro-life, voted for constitutional carry, et cetera, but a little bit lost to Richard Raymond, who came out for the ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying, as an example. But Tim, I mean, Kyle Cassell is someone who was close to Strauss when Strauss was still in power, someone who was in favor of Medicaid expansion this session. It's a very surprising outcome for the state representative from like Bryan, Texas, to be here at a 28.
Yeah, it really is, and it's not odd to see a Republican, and even back in the Sarah Davis days, we had crossovers where we had some Republicans that were actually lower than Democrats. I will say, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember kind of where that meeting was, it seems like in past sessions it was more upwards, more in the 30s or 40s.
Yeah, that'd be about right.
Yeah,
I do think if Sarah Davis had not been beat by a Democrat, she would have performed here worse than Richard Raymond and Ryan Guillen. No doubt about it. Knowing her, she'd probably end up with like a 19 or something in the Fiscal Responsibility Index this session. A very interesting thing. But of course, there are two chambers in the Texas legislature. We've talked about the Texas House. Now let's move to the Texas Senate, where it's kind of a lot more subdued. Tim, I know that, you have to have basically the votes in advance to even bring a bill to the floor. We see a lot more clustering of Republican lawmakers. And then when you think about Republican priorities and where they died, the vast majority of them die in the Texas House. Yeah. The one opportunity where grassroots activists knew that the Texas Senate was the blocker this session was on constitutional carry. They lit up Dan Patrick and their state senators' offices for about 2 weeks. And the Texas Senate passed the bill. So here, looking at the Texas Senate, we will see scores that are much more improved than their House counterparts. But that's partly because they just weren't the problem, and a lot of because they get to choose what the votes are.
Yeah, I think, for the most part, they're taking less votes in the Senate. And the fact that, all of the votes have been whipped and they know what's coming to the floor, a lot more so than the House. For the most part, we see the Senate as producing more conservative legislation. This session was not any different whatsoever, but of course, it does make it a little more difficult to kind of show a dichotomy. Since they are more conservative, you have less controversial votes that they go on record for. But overall, we do produce more conservative legislation, and we do see more conservative legislation die in the House as well.
Right. So just to give us all some top lines for the Texas Senate, we have 79 total votes, with the best Republican coming in at a 90, so barely scraping in as a taxpayer champion. The worst Republican coming in at a 57. Meanwhile, the best Democrat has a 30, and the worst Democrat has a 10. There's 1A, which we mentioned before. There are 12 passing lawmakers. The GOP average is a 73.1, so that's passing. That's markedly better than the Texas House. The Democrat average, however, is an 18, and that's actually a lot worse than previous sessions. If we want to kind of talk about the reasoning for this, it's because there were a lot of election integrity bills that were pretty much party line votes. So we saw a lot about that. But Tim, let's go ahead and talk about our one taxpayer champion in the Texas Senate, and that is State Senator Bob Hall, also from East Texas.
Yeah, Bob Hall has, I think, been a taxpayer champion since he's been in office. He's always been really impressive on fiscal issues. He's one who's championed securing the electric grid in the past and has kind of championed that issue. And so I'm not really surprised to see him at an A. I was kind of surprised he was the only A, but it's not surprising to see Bob Hall. He's a great conservative legislator.
Yeah, absolutely. If you go and march down into the B's, you'll see State Senator Brandon Creighton, State Senator Drew Springer, a number of other folks. I think there is a surprise. You see that the state Senate Republican scores dropped for kind of the more middle-of-the-road lawmakers this session, but you do see a number of other positive lawmakers there. But let's get to the worst Republican lawmaker, and this will come as a surprise to nobody. He's been the worst Republican lawmaker in the Texas Senate for the past few sessions, and that, of course, is State Senator Kel Seliger, who represents a wonky district that runs all the way from Midland to Amarillo. Tim, Kel Seliger is a guy who's been in the penalty box in the Texas Senate, has been someone that taxpayers have known as bad commodity, and I guess he lived up to it.
Yeah, I think in my mind, I would imagine he's not too worried about the Texas Fiscal Responsibility Index since he continues to get reelected.
Yeah.
But he is kind of your more leftist Republican, not only on fiscal issues, but there was rumors in the Capitol that he was one of the holdouts for constitutional carry. And so not really surprising from Seliger.
Yeah, pretty frustrating result, but kind of par for the course in terms of his record. Then kind of rounding it out to get to our best performer, it is State Senator Eddie Lucio from the Rio Grande Valley, a Democrat lawmaker who voted for a lot of the pro-life legislation this session, someone who's repeatedly bucked his party. If we think about the Women's Privacy Act back in previous sessions, we see that kind of his governing mentality, it's not just contained to the social issues, which we don't include on the Fiscal Responsibility Index. He's better than all the other Democrats on the other issues too.
Yeah, he is. And once again, he's been pretty consistent here as far as a leader in the Senate. And so, once again, it's not very surprising to see him at the top.
Absolutely. Well, to find out how your lawmakers scored on the Fiscal Responsibility Index, please visit index.texastaxpayers.com. There you can see how they performed on the index, what votes we chose to include, how they voted on that, how they compare to other lawmakers, perhaps nearby or across the state that you're interested in. I know we're going to have a contentious, perhaps special session coming up where these might change. We might kind of crack open the hood and get back to it and let lawmakers kind of earn a little bit better if they deliver positive results for Texas. Regardless, we're going to have a very active election season, accountability season, where taxpayers just like you get to hold each of these public servants accountable. If you have any questions about anything here, please feel free to reach out through Tim and I. Drop a message here in the comments. Shoot us an email at texastaxpayers.com. We'd be happy to get to you. Tim, any closing thoughts on the Fiscal Responsibility Index, what taxpayers can do to use it, to get involved?
Yeah, I think, it gives you a very good gauge specifically on fiscal issues. So if you're concerned about your property taxes, if you are concerned about the growth of government, it's a tool that you can use in this contentious primary season that we have coming up and the general election and midterms, that you can get a very good idea of where does my lawmaker stand when it comes to spending my tax dollars, and are they being responsible or not?
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining us here. Again, my name is Cary Cheshire, joined by Tim Harden with Texans for Fiscal Responsibility, talking about the Fiscal Responsibility Index, which you can view for yourself at index.texastaxpayers.com. Thanks, and God bless Texas.
God bless.